It took just 19 seconds for Jasmine Crockett to turn the Texas Capitol into a war zone. On live TV, she accused Governor Greg Abbott of rigging the vote for 4.3 million minority citizens, then slammed a USB drive into the podium. The lights flickered, the microphones hissed, and a voice filled the room. A voice Abbott never wanted the public to hear. Reporters froze, security moved in, and you could feel the democracy itself hanging by a thread. If you heard what came next, would you ever trust your leaders again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The August heat pressed against the glass of the Texas Capitol's hearing room like a living thing, each ray of sunlight filtered through the tall windows carrying the heavy, baked air of Austin's summer streets. Inside, the space pulsed with a low mechanical hum from the broadcast equipment, a sound so constant it blended into the tension radiating from the crowd. The smell was a cocktail of stale coffee left to lawn in paper cups, the dry, dusty scent of stacks of legal documents, and the faint metallic tang from the microphones lined up along the long mahogany desk. Every seat was taken: politicians in crisp suits, reporters with lenses like sniper scopes, aides shifting restlessly, their tablets glowing with incoming headlines. Then, the click of heels broke the undercurrent. Jasmine Crockett appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a scarlet blazer that cut a streak of fire across the muted room. Her stride was deliberate, the kind of walk that didn't just enter a space but claimed it. In her hand, a thick folder, edges worn, contents tightly bound, hugged against her ribs, as though it carried the weight of something dangerous. Cameras swiveled toward her like predators tracking prey, their lenses swallowing every flicker of her expression. She didn't look left or right. Across the table, Greg Abbott sat already in place, the navy fabric of his suit catching the light, his hands folded in an almost priestly gesture. But the smile curled at the edge of his mouth wasn't kindness, it was calculation, the kind of smile that said he'd already gamed out 10 different ways to win this moment. The Margaret pin on his lapel seemed to gleam brighter than the overhead lights, as if reminding the room exactly where his loyalties lay. The reporters knew something was coming. You could see it in their restless glances at one another, in the way a few of them already had their thumbs hovering above record on their phones. Somewhere, a pen clicked twice, a chair leg scraped the marble floor. Small, meaningless sounds, but in this air, they were electric. Jasmine took her seat slowly, her eyes locking on Abbott's. He didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The invisible line between them had been drawn. No one in the room could articulate it yet, but the temperature felt different now, not from the weather outside, but from the friction of two forces about to collide in full view of the nation. It was the feeling of a match being struck in a locked room, the knowledge that the smallest movement could ignite everything. By the time the gavel would fall, reputations would be in ruins, careers hanging by threads, and trust itself cracked open for the world to see. Only one question mattered now when the dust settled: whose name would history carve into the rubble? Jasmine rose slowly, the chair's legs scraping against the marble floor like a warning siren. She placed both hands on the desk, leaning forward into the microphone, the red of her blazer blazing against the muted tones of the chamber. Her voice came low at first, almost measured, but each word carried the weight of a verdict. In Texas, black voters now hold just 1/5 of the representation they are owed. Latino communities 1/3. Asian Americans practically erased. The numbers fell into the air like stones, heavy and inignorable. Camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts, each flash freezing her expression in time, the steel in her eyes caught for millions to see. The broadcast cut between her face and Greg Abbott's. He sat with that same patient smirk, chin tilted, as though waiting for a storm to blow over. But this wasn't weather, it was an incoming strike. The live feed flickered with quick inserts of news archives, a 2011 clip of activists marching under the Texas sun, signs screaming "Stop gerrymandering." Aerial shots of neighborhoods sliced into bizarre, jagged shapes on voting maps. Footage of courtrooms where attorneys argue over lines as if they were borders between countries. Back in the present, Jasmine's voice grew sharper, the tempo of her delivery matching the heartbeat of a nation watching. These maps are not neutral. They are weapons designed with precision to silence voices that inconvenience those in power. A murmur rippled through the gallery, the sound of shock restrained by formality. Abbott's smirk didn't fade, but his fingers tapped once on the table, small, rhythmic, betraying a pulse quickening beneath the facade. The camera caught every detail, the bead of sweat tracing the temple of a legislative aide, The quick glance exchange between two Republican lawmakers in the back row, the subtle tightening of Abbott's jaw. Jasmine flipped to a large laminated map, sliding it forward so the whole room could see the surgical cruelty of the district line splitting communities block by block, threading white majority areas together while slicing minority-heavy neighborhoods into powerless fragments. Her finger traced one curve of the map and stopped abruptly. "Here," she said, "is where a single street divides a black neighborhood from its own political votes. Here's where the votes of thousands vanish into someone else's pocket." Every frame of the broadcast made it clear. These weren't just cartographers' lines. They were levers, pulled in smoke-filled rooms to tip the balance of power. Somewhere outside, the sound of a protest's distant chant seeped faintly through the glass, like a drumbeat for the battle unfolding inside. Jasmine's eyes swept across the chamber, landing on Abbott again. She didn't blink. "This isn't about maps," she said, each syllable like a nail being driven into the table. "This is about who gets to decide what America is and who gets erased from it." The room was silent, but the silence wasn't peace, it was the vacuum before impact, the pause before history decides which side survives the blast. Abbott leaned forward into his microphone, the overhead lights catching the faint sheen on his forehead, though his smile was as sharp as a razor. "It wouldn't be a day ending in why if Jasmine didn't cry racism," he said, his voice carrying an almost rehearsed casualness, like a stand-up comic dropping a punchline he'd been waiting to use. The chamber reacted instantly, not with laughter, but with that restless, electric murmur that rolls through a crowd when something ugly has been said in public. Several reporters' heads jerked out from their notes. A few aides tried to hide their smirks. The remark hit Twitter within seconds, spliced into a 10-second clip by an opportunistic journalist, the caption blazing in all caps, "Abbott mocks Crockett on Live TV." Phones vibrated across the room as alerts multiply, the hearing transforming in real time into a trending battlefront. The camera cut to Jasmine. She didn't move, didn't rise, didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she looked at Abbott with a stillness that was more dangerous than any outburst of quiet, deliberate glare that felt like the tightening of a bowstring. Her hands rested lightly on the folder in front of her, but there was no mistaking the slight pressure of her fingers, as though she were holding back the urge to crush the papers in her grip. She blinked once, slowly, and then her gaze slid toward the audience, as if taking in the collective appetite for the fight they knew was coming. The air in the chamber felt heavier, hotter, a pressure cooker sealed tight. Abbott reclined in his chair, fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the armrest, the picture of a man who believed he'd landed the first blow. Around him, a few allies leaned in to whisper, their lips curling into quiet satisfaction. But in the corner of the frame, a young staffer shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the governor and the congresswoman, as though sensing that the room's balance was tilting in a way Abbott couldn't yet feel. Jasmine's stillness wasn't submission, it was precision. Every second she waited, the tension cold tighter. The cameras knew it, lingering on her expression, searching for a crack that didn't come. On social media, the clip of Abbott's chat was already being dissected by pundits and activists, each side sharpening their narratives. But in the hearing room, the only sound now was the soft hum of the broadcast equipment and the faint shuffle of papers. She let the silence stretch 10 seconds, 15 long enough for Abbott's confidence to swell, long enough for the audience to think maybe she wouldn't bite back. Then, with the smallest of movements, she adjusted the folder in front of her, her thumb brushing the edge of a USB drive hidden beneath the papers. She looked back at Abbott, and for the first time since his comment, her lips curved into something between a smirk and a promise. The camera caught that look, zooming in as her voice finally broke the silence. "Governor, I'll respond to your little joke in due time, but when I do, I promise, you won't be laughing." And in that moment, even those who had come to see her fail leaned forward in their seats, because everyone could feel it. What she was about to put on the record wouldn't just scorch the man across from her. It would burn straight through to the White House. The area in the underground hallway was cooler than the chamber above, but it carried a damp, metallic chill that clung to the skin. Dim fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing thin pools of pale light onto the concrete floor, each one separated by stretches of shadow. Jasmine's heels echoed in sharp, deliberate strikes, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls and merging with the distant hum of ventilation fans. She was halfway to the side exit when she caught two voices, low and urgent, spilling out from around the corner. Trump's call went longer than expected, one aide murmured, the tone clipped, like someone speaking through clenched teeth. Abbott told him the lines are set, 5 MAGA seats locked no matter what. The second voice was hushed, almost swallowed by the hum of the lights. And the minorities, he said they'd adapt. That it's all just numbers. Jasmine froze mid-step, her shadow stretching into the halo of light ahead. Her briefcase dangled at her side, and for a moment, she simply stared at the gray wall in front of her, her breathing slowing. Then the light above her flickered once, twice casting the hallway into momentary darkness before buzzing back to life. The camera of the mind zoomed tight on her hand as it rose, her knuckles whitening around the handle of the case until the leather strained. That single movement carried more fury than any speech she could have made. The aides, unaware they were being overheard, continued moving down the intersecting hallway, their words fading into a blur of bureaucratic and political shorthand. But the phrase Trump's call hung in Jasmine's ears like a warning bell. She could hear every click of her own pulse, every subtle shift of her breath, as the pieces began to lock together. Abbott's smirk, the district lines, the USB drive in her folder, and now this. She took a step forward, her heel catching the edge of a floor grate with a metallic ring. One of the aides paused mid-sentence, the rhythm of their speech breaking, and for a heartbeat the air in the tunnel felt like glassed in, fragile, ready to shatter. Then footsteps resumed, fading into the distance until there was nothing left but the buzz of the lights and the hollow, unbroken space between her and the truth she now carried. Jasmine's jaw tightened. She didn't just have a fight on her hands, she had proof that the fight reached beyond Texas, beyond Abbott, straight into the orbit of the most divisive figure in modern American politics. Slowly, she adjusted her grip on the briefcase, the leather creaking in protest, and started walking again, each step heavier, more deliberate. Up ahead, the stairs back to the hearing chamber waited. The cameras would still be rolling. And when she stepped into that light again, she wouldn't just be facing a governor, she'd be walking straight toward a political detonation that could rattle the foundations of the Capitol itself. The only question now was whether anyone in that room would be ready for the blast when it came. Maria Lopez sat in the shadow corner of a small cafe just 3 blocks from the Capitol, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped porcelain cup. The steam from her coffee curled upward, but her eyes were somewhere far away on streets she no longer recognized, on a neighborhood carved apart by lines she never voted for. She was in her late 30s, hair pulled back in a neat bun, but there was a quiet exhaustion in her face, the kind that comes from fighting battles no one else sees. They split us, she said, her voice steady but thin, white down the middle. My street used to be part of a district where our representative knew us, knew our schools, our problems, our names. Now, half of my neighbors are in one district, the other half in another. We're a number now, not a community. Jasmine listened without interrupting, the nose of the cafe clinking cups, murmured conversations muting into the background. Maria's fingers trembled as she pulled a folded flyer from her purse, one from the last election, showing her former representative smiling with children from their block. I used to think my vote mattered, Maria continued, but now it's like shouting into a storm. They can't hear me, not when they drew the lines to make sure my voice gets lost. Jasmine leaned in, her elbows on the table, and there was no trace of the controlled, measured politician here, just a woman who recognized the taste of injustice. In Maria's voice, she heard echoes of her own childhood in South Dallas, the day her elementary school lost funding because the district map shifted, the memory of her mother crying at the kitchen table when a local council seat went to someone who didn't even campaign in their part of town. She remembered her grandmother warning her, "They don't have to take your vote away if they can take away what your vote means." That truth had lived in Jasmine's bones for decades, and now it stared back at her from across the table. "I want you in that hearing," Jasmine said finally, the decision landing like a gavel strike. "I want them to see you, to hear you. Abbott's going to try to stop it. He's going to claim your testimony isn't relevant, but you are the proof. This isn't just lines on paper. This is people's lives being dismantled." Maria hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window where the Capitol dome loomed in the distance. "If I speak, they'll know my name. My kids' names." Jasmine didn't blink. "Good. Let them. Tower counts on your silence. Break it, and they lose." For a moment, neither woman spoke, the air between them heavy with the weight of what they'd just agreed to. Maria nodded once, a small but irrevocable act of courage. Jasmine reached for her coffee, but her mind was already back in that chamber, already bracing for the clash to come. She knew Abbott would try to bury Maria's story before it reached daylight. But this time, she was ready to dig it up, drag it into the light, and make the whole country look. And when they did, there'd be no pretending they didn't see what had been done. The parking garage beneath the Capitol was half empty, its concrete pillars standing like silent sentinels in the dim amber glow of overhead lamps. The air smelled faintly of oil and cold steel, each footstep echoing with a metallic bite. Jasmine moved cautiously between the rows, her red blazer muted to shadow under the flickering light. She spotted him by the far column. David Nguyen, a name whispered in back channels but never seen in public reports. He wore a charcoal hoodie, hands buried in the pockets, his posture casual but his eyes sharp, scanning the emptiness around them like a man who had been followed before. "You're late," David said quietly, the words almost swallowed by the hum of the ventilation fans. Jasmine stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, her voice calm but edged. "You said it was urgent." He glanced toward the ramp leading out, then reached into his hoodie. What emerged was a small, matte black USB drive, no larger than a thumb, but in this moment it might as well have been a live grenade. He didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, he held it between them, his gaze locked on hers. "Play this at the right moment," he said, voice lowering to a whisper, "and you'll end his career." The sound of a car door slamming in the distance jolted the air. Both turned instinctively toward the nose, but the garage remained still. David stepped forward and pressed the drive into her palm, his fingers cold and firm. "Don't ask how I got it," he added, "and don't keep it in the open. If they know you have this, they'll come for you before the hearing ends." Jasmine closed her fingers around the drive, feeling its edges bite into her skin. "What's on it?" she asked, her voice flat. David's eyes shifted, not to her but to the shadows behind her, as if the answer itself was dangerous to speak aloud. "The truth," his voice, "and proof that the maps are just the start." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the only sound the steady drip of water from a pipe overhead. Then David stepped back, pulling his hood up. "You'll know when to use it," he said, already retreating into the maze of concrete. His figure dissolved into shadow, leaving her alone with the weight in her hand. Jasmine looked down at the small piece of plastic and metal, its surface catching the weak light. The camera of the mind would zoom in tight, unflinching on her clenched fist. In the back of her mind, the hearing room loomed, Abbott's smirk still fresh, Maria Lopez's voice still trembling in her memory. She slid the USB into her briefcase, the zipper closing with a final, metallic hiss. Her voice, low and deliberate, cut through the quiet like a verdict. "This is either my greatest weapon, or my ticket out of politics forever, and God help him if it's the former." The second hearing felt different before it even began. The chamber was swollen beyond capacity, the air thick with the body heat of twice as many people as the day before. Camera crews had multiplied, tripods jammed shoulder to shoulder, lenses glinting under the harsh white ceiling lights, each one trained on the long table where the governor and the congresswoman would soon collide again. The sound was a restless murmur, punctuated by the quick, staccato bursts of photographers testing their flashes, each one a white-hot spark in the room's charged atmosphere. Somewhere in the back, a protester's chant seeped faintly through the heavy wooden doors, a reminder that this fight had already spilled beyond these walls. Greg Abbott entered with the controlled swagger of a man who had spent his life on stages like this. He adjusted his jacket, settled into his seat, and leaned toward the microphone as if the entire spectacle had been built solely for him. "This," he began, gesturing to the sprawling map projected behind him, "isn't about taking power away. It's about giving it to Hispanic voters who believe in the promise of Texas voters who have been ignored by the Democratic Party for far too long." His tone was smooth, rehearsed, the kind of delivery meant to sound like reason while planting seeds of division. As he spoke, he looked directly at the cameras, not the room, as if bypassing everyone here to speak straight to millions watching at home. The words hung in the air, each one carefully placed to counter the damage from the previous session. The camera cut to Jasmine. She hadn't moved since he began, her posture deceptively relaxed. Her fingers tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished wood of the desk, the same measured beat over and over, like a drummer marking time before the music shifts. Beneath the table, her foot pressed against the carpet, anchored, ready, her eyes never left Abbott's face. Abbott kept talking, layering his argument with phrases about fairness and equal opportunity, each line crafted to sound unassailable. But for those who knew how to listen, there was a gap of space where something unsaid lingered like smoke in the air. Jasmine heard it. She could feel it in the way his jaw tightened a fraction too long after mentioning the future of Texas. The tension had a weight now, a physical presence in the room. Even the camera crew seemed to sense it, their movements slowing, their lenses lingering longer on the woman in red who sat motionless, storing her words like ammunition. Outside, the chanting grew louder, the beat of voices sensing with the steady tap of Jasmine's fingers. She leaned forward just slightly, enough for the microphones to pick up the faint scrape of her chair legs. She didn't speak, not yet. But in the narrowing space between Abbott's confident cadence and the moment she would cut him off, the air seemed to still, every breath in the room drawn tight. She wasn't just waiting to respond, she was waiting to detonate. And when she did, it wouldn't just be Abbott who felt the blast. Jasmine let the silence hang for a breath after Abbott's last word, then leaned toward her microphone, her voice cutting through the air like glass snapping. "I'd like to bring forward someone who can tell you what these lines mean outside of your polished speeches, Governor." She turned her head toward the gallery, scanning the faces until her eyes found Maria Lopez. The woman stood hesitantly, clutching the strap of her worn leather bag, the weight of 1,000 eyes on her. She made her way to the witness table, each step echoing through the room, the dull thud of her heels carrying the gravity of someone walking toward the point of no return. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Her voice, at first, was barely above a whisper, but the chamber was so still it seemed to amplify her words. "My neighborhood used to be whole," she began. "We had a representative who came to our block meetings, who knew our schools, who understood when our kids needed help. Then, one cut us in half. My street is in one district, my sister's in another. Now, no one knows us. No one hears us." Her throat caught on the last words, but she pushed on, voice cracking. "You didn't just draw new lines, Governor, you erased us from our own home." The room seemed to contract around her testimony. Reporters froze mid-note. One camera operator zoomed in so tight the frame caught the glint of a tear as it slid down Maria's cheek. Jasmine's eyes stayed locked on her witness, her expression unreadable, but her jaw tight enough to betray the storm beneath. Abbott shifted in his seat, leaning toward his microphone. "With all due respect," he started, his voice calm but threaded with that patronizing edge he wielded like a blade. Jasmine didn't even look at him. She raised her hand sharply, palm out, and her tone hit like a gavel strike. "You had your turn, Governor. Now let the people speak." The firmness in her voice sliced clean through his interruption, and a low murmur rippled through the room, approval from some, shock from others. Maria swallowed hard, glancing briefly at Abbott before looking back at the panel. "We aren't numbers on a chart," she said. "We're families, we're voters. And we're tired of being invisible just because it makes someone else's math easier." Her words landed heavy, the kind that couldn't be swept aside by talking points. When she finished, the quiet was absolute. Not even the shuffle of papers or the click of a pen dared to break it. Jasmine leaned forward again, her voice softer now but carrying farther than any shout. "This is what your map does, Governor. It takes people who built this state and tells them they don't count." She let the sentence hang, her gaze never leaving his. "And if you think this room is the last place you'll hear from them, you're already underestimating the fight you've started." Jasmine didn't speak right away. She simply reached into her briefcase, the faint rasp of the zipper slicing through the stillness. Her hand emerged with a small, matte-black USB drive, the kind that could just as easily contain a slideshow or a political guillotine. She slid it toward the technician at the end of the table, her eyes never leaving Abbott. "Play track 1, she said, the calm in her voice almost unsettling. The overhead speakers crackled to life, carrying the hiss of a phone line and the muffled sound of shuffling papers. Then, Abbott's unmistakable voice filled the chamber. "We'll hold 5 MAGA seats, no matter what. I don't care what the census says, those lines are locked." The words landed like an explosion in a confined space. For a split second, there was only the hiss of the recording, and then the room erupted. Gasps from the gallery, the metallic clatter of pens hitting desks, reporters scrambling from their chairs and bolting for the exit, phones already pressed to their ears. The sharp whir of camera shutters became frantic, desperate to capture the exact moment a governor's armor cracked. On the projection screen, the technician cued the audio to replay the line. Abbott's voice came again, more damning with each repetition. No matter what. Those lines are locked. Jasmine sat back, her expression unreadable, hands folded in front of her like a judge waiting for the jury to finish absorbing the evidence. But her eyes stayed locked on him, studying the micro-expressions, the brief flare of his nostrils, the tightening at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers twitched once against the tabletop. Abbott shifted in his seat, leaning toward his microphone, his tone lower now, weighted with something between command and desperation. "Turn that off," he said. The technician didn't move. A beat passed, and Abbott's voice rose, sharper. "Turn it off. Now." The demand cut through the chaos, but it was too late. The damage was already running live on every network, the clip being clipped, shared, and dissected in real time by millions of viewers. Jasmine tilted her head, as if considering his order, then leaned slightly toward her own microphone. "Governor, I think the people deserve to hear the whole truth, don't you?" Her words landed in the quiet space between his demand and the technician's hesitation, stretching the moment like a taut wire. The murmurs swelled again, a restless wave rolling through the room as everyone waited for the next blow. Abbott's jaw locked tight, the muscles in his temple flexing as he leaned in, eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stripped away any pretense of civility. "Crockett," he said, his voice low enough that only the nearest microphones caught it, "you have no idea what you're about to start." Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm starting." And somewhere beyond the heavy wooden doors, the protest chants grew louder, as if the outside world had already decided the fight was theirs now too. Abbott straightened in his chair, both hands gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring himself before impact. The low camera angle caught him from just beneath the jawline, tilting upward to give him a looming presence, shoulders squared, chin height, the backdrop of the Texas flag flaring behind him like a war banner. His voice came hard and fast, sharp enough to slice through the roar of murmurs that had followed the USB bombshell. "What we're seeing here," he began, stabbing the air with his index finger, "isn't about fairness. It's not about truth. It's about weaponizing race to divide this state." The microphones caught every ounce of venom in his tone. He leaned forward, his face now filling the levee, and his words landed like hammer blows. "Congresswoman Crockett doesn't want unity, she wants division. She doesn't want representation, she wants control. And she will twist numbers, twist communities, twist the very idea of democracy, if it gets her what she wants." His hand flattened on the table, palm smacking the woe, the sound echoing in the room and jolting a few reporters in their seats. The camera cut between his towering frame and Jasmine's stillness. She sat motionless, eyes locked on him, her hands clasped in front of her like a defendant who knew the jury was about to hear a lie. The low-shot made Abbott look almost monolithic, a man on the offensive, the veins in his neck tightening as his voice swelled. "This state was built by people who didn't see themselves as colors on a chart," he declared. "It was built by Texans who earned their say, not by politicians who tell them their vote only matters if it checks the right box." He paused just long enough to let his words settle, scanning the faces in the gallery, to corners of his mouth curving in the faintest smirk when he spotted nods from a few allies. "She talks about erasure," he went on. "What she's erasing is the truth that the Hispanic community is moving toward the values that make Texas strong. That's why she's afraid. That's why she's here, spinning stories instead of respecting voters' choices." From the low angle, the light caught the sheen of sweat on his brow, but his voice never wavered. "The only thing being stolen here is the dignity of this process. And I will not," his voice sharpened to a point, "sit here and watch the people of this state be reduced to pawns in her political theater." He leaned back finally, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to give the illusion of control. That the silence that followed wasn't deference, it was the kind of pause a crowd takes when they know the next strike is coming. Abbott had thrown his punch with all the force he could muster. Now every lens in the room pivoted back to Jasmine, waiting to see if she'd block it or drive the next blow straight through him. Outside the Capitol, the air was electric thick with August heat and the collective pulse of a nation watching in real time. Satellite vans jammed the curbs, their telescoping antennas stabbing into the hazy blue sky. On one side of the plaza, Fox News cameras captured Abbott's most defiant lines, framing him as a bulwark against radical race politics. On the other, MSNBC anchors replayed the USB audio on a loop, each time cutting to analysts, dissecting every syllable like forensic linguists. The split-screen coverage was a visual civil war. Two Americas, two truths, two irreconcilable versions of what had just happened. Twitter was a live wire. Hashtags erupting like gunfire. Hashtag Crockett vs. Abbott trending #1 nationwide. Hashtag Mattgate climbing fast behind it. Clips of Abbott's smirk, Jasmine's glare, and Maria Lopez's tear-streaked testimony flooded timelines, each one reframed by thousands of users to fit their own battle cry. Memes were already circulating. Jasmine as Joan of Arc, Abbott as a medieval king clinging to a crumbling throne. In political group chats, operatives on both sides scrambled to control the narrative, their thumbs blurring across screens in a frenzy of talking points and counterattacks. On the Capitol steps, the noise was deafening. Jasmine's supporters had swelled from a few dozen to several hundred in less than an hour. College students, retired teachers, union members, pastors in clerical collars, mothers pushing strollers. Hand-painted signs bobbed in the crowd. Our votes aren't yours to cut, democracy has no district lines, and the blunt, all-caps Abbott is afraid. A young woman with a bullhorn led a chant that rolled over the crowd in waves, the call and response echoing against the stone facade. Reporters darted between clusters of demonstrators, pulling quotes for the evening news. Some caught fragments of anger. He thinks we won't notice, but we're here. Others caught pure resolve. She's not just fighting for Texas, she's fighting for the whole country. A few Abbott supporters lingered at the edge of the plaza, holding their own banners and glaring at the opposing chants. Tension flared in shouted words, but the police line kept both sides from colliding. High above, from a third-floor window, a photographer captured the scene, the steps awash in bodies, the Texas flag rippling in the heat, and the shadow of the Capitol dome stretching over the protest like a silent clock counting down. Inside the building, the hearing still churned on, but out here, the story had already grown bigger than the room. Every chant, every retweet, every breaking news chyron was tightening the vice around Abbott's narrative. What had started as a redistricting hearing was mutating into something larger, something neither side could fully control. And in that gathering storm of voices and screens, there was an unspoken truth vibrating in the air. When Jasmine walked out those doors again, she wouldn't just be facing the governor, she'd be stepping into a fight that had already spilled into the veins of the country. And this time, the country was ready to swing back. Abbott's voice cut through the chamber like a whip crack, his chair scraping back slightly as he leaned into the microphone. "You're not here for fairness," he said, each word deliberate, almost spitting the consonants. "You're here for power." The low camera angle caught the way his shadow stretched across the table toward her, the Texas flag behind him looming like an accusation. The words rippled through the room, drawing a sharp intake of breath from the gallery. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch, her eyes locked on him as if measuring the exact weight of the insult. Then she leaned forward, her fingertips pressing into the wood, knuckles whitening. "Tower," she said, her tone slow, cold. "No, Governor, I'm here to make sure you can't steal it." The words landed heavy, like a door slamming shut, and a murmur erupted from the crowd, half applause, half gasp. Abbott's jaw tightened, his voice rising. "This is the problem with you, Congresswoman. You come in here with your theatrics, your staged witnesses, and your gotcha recordings, trying to turn this into some kind of trial." Jasmine's answer was immediate, razor sharp. "No, Governor, this is a trial. The difference is you're not used to being the one under oath." Cameras zoomed tight on her face, the glint in her eyes somewhere between fury and conviction, the kind of look that turns sound bites into headlines. Abbott leaned forward so far their microphones nearly crossed, the air between them electric, dangerous. "You think you can win this with a stunt? You think you can scare me?" Jasmine's voice dropped to a near whisper, but the room was so silent it carried farther than a shout. "I don't have to scare you, Governor. I just have to show them who you are." Her gaze flicked toward the cameras, and it was clear she meant not just the committee but the millions watching beyond these walls. The tension snapped like a live wire. Supporters in the gallery started clapping, opponents shouted over them. Two reporters in the aisle leaned into each other, already framing their leads. Abbott's hands gripped the table so tightly the tendons stood out like cables. Jasmine sat back, folding her arms, her expression calm now, but her words still hanging in the air like smoke after a shot. The committee chair's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between the two as if calculating just how much longer he could keep the lid on this without the whole thing boiling over. Finally, he lifted the gavel and brought it down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. "Order," he barked, the room quieted by degrees, but the current running through it didn't fade. He raised the gavel again, his voice taut. "Order, or this session is over." For a long moment, neither Abbott nor Jasmine moved, the cameras held steady. Outside, the chants from the steps grew louder, pounding like war drums. The chair's warning still hung in the air, but everyone in the room knew the truth. What was coming next wouldn't be contained by would-end rules. It was already spilling over. The hallway was narrow enough that the sound of their footsteps seemed to ricochet off the cream-colored walls, each echo chasing the other down toward the shadowed end. The fluorescent lights here were dimmer, older, casting a faint yellow over the marble floor. No cameras, no microphones, just the heavy air between two people who had spent hours locked in public combat and now stood within arm's reach, stripped of the insulation of audience and stagecraft. Abbott's wheelchair rolled to a stop just a few feet from her, the faint squeak of the rubber tires punctuating the silence. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes hard, his voice pitched low enough that it felt like the words were meant to slip under the skin. "If you release more," he said, each syllable precise, "you'll regret it." The sentence didn't come as a threat shouted in anger, it came like a confession from someone used to being obeyed. The kind of tone that carried the weight of backroom deals, closed-door power, and levers most people didn't even know existed. Jasmine stood her ground, the stale chill of the air conditioning brushing against the heat in her skin. She could hear the faint murmur of voices somewhere behind her, staffers heading toward the chamber, the distant slam of a heavy door. None of it mattered. All she saw was the man in front of her, the smirk absent now, replaced with something sharper, something that believed fear could still work on her. She tilted her head just slightly, studying him as though weighing the value of his words against the cost of her silence. "Try me," she said finally, the phrase quiet but edged like broken glass. It was the kind of answer that didn't just refuse the threat, it sent it back across the line. Her eyes didn't waver. Not when Abbott's mouth twitched into the faintest shadow of a smile. Not when he let out a slow breath that sounded more like a calculation than a release of tension. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze narrowing. "You think this is about me? This is bigger than one governor, Congresswoman. There are people in this building, in this state, in this country, people you don't even know exist, who won't let you walk away from this fight intact." His words were calm, almost casual, but the undercurrent was cold steel. Jasmine's reply was immediate. "Good," she said, taking a half step closer. "Let them come. If they want to fight, they can stand in line behind you." The space between them felt smaller now, the air heavy with the knowledge that whatever came next would be irreversible. Abbott didn't answer. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned and rolled away down the hallway, the hum of his wheels fading into the distance. Jasmine stayed where she was, her hand brushing the outline of the USB drive through the fabric of her blazer pocket. In her mind, she wasn't just holding evidence, she was holding the fuse. And after this, there was no question. She was going to light it. The chamber was already humming when Jasmine returned, the restless energy of a room that sensed blood in the water but didn't yet know from which direction it would spill. Abbott sat rigid, his expression unreadable, but his knuckles pale against the tabletop. The committee chair cleared his throat, ready to resume the agenda, but Jasmine's voice cut cleanly through the ambient noise before he could speak. "I have documents," she said, her tone sharp enough to command silence. Her hands moved with deliberate precision, sliding a thick manila folder into the center of the table. The microphones caught the faint scrape of paper as she drew out a series of printed emails, each one stamped with the insignia of the governor's office. "These," she continued, holding them up for the cameras, "or internal communications between the governor's staff and senior party strategists, emails detailing how to redraw districts to minimize minority voting strength." The first image flashed onto the projector screen, and the words burned into the room in stark black and white. "Target urban clusters, dilute concentrations, maintain advantage." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Jasmine flipped to the next slide, revealing another email chain. "Breaking up Latino-heavy districts, ensures stronger MAGA margins." Expected loss of minority representation, is acceptable collateral. The reaction was instantaneous. Half the audience shot to their feet, voices rising into a roar of disbelief and outrage. Shame, someone shouted from the back. Another voice boomed, "You're stealing our votes." The gallery became a living tide, protesters on their feet, fists in the air, some pointing directly at Abbott. Security moved in fast, their dark uniforms weaving through the aisles to contain the uproar, but the sound wouldn't be contained. Chants broke out raw, unfiltered, echoing off the marble walls, "Our votes matter. This is corruption." The committee chair banged his gavel, calling for order, but the gavel's hollow thud was drowned in the swelling noise. Abbott leaned toward his microphone, his face flushed. "This is a stunt," he barked, but the words barely registered over the clamor. Jasmine didn't flinch. She let the chaos breathe, let the room marinate in the sight of those damning words projected 30 feet high. When she spoke again, it was with the clarity of a blade sliding free of its sheath. "This isn't about party lines," she said, her voice cutting across the nose. "It's about whether we still believe in the promise that every voice counts." Security officers corralled a group of protesters toward the exit, but their voices carried to the very end, the final shame hanging in the air long after they were gone. The chamber's energy didn't settle, it simmered, a barely contained boil. Jasmine gathered the papers in front of her, her gaze never leaving Abbott's. "These are your words, Governor, your plan. Your signature on the strategy to erase voters who don't fit your vision of Texas." The room fell into a charged silence, broken only by the whir of camera lenses zooming in. And in that silence, one truth settled over everyone present. If this was what she was willing to reveal now, what else was she still holding back? Abbott's composure had been fraying for the last 10 minutes, each new document Jasmine projected peeling another layer off the mask he wore so effortlessly in front of cameras. His knuckles were bone white now, his jaw clenching so tightly the muscle at his temple jumped with each breath. The gallery had settled into a tense, watchful quiet, less out of calm than the collective instinct that they were seconds away from seeing something raw and irreversible. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her voice low but aimed to pierce. "You can explain those emails to the people of Texas, or you can keep pretending they don't exist. Either way, they'll hear them in your own words." She tapped the folder once, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. Abbott's eyes flicked to the rows of cameras, then back to her. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. A bead of sweat rolled down from his hairline, disappearing into his collar. Finally, with a sudden burst of volume that startled even the committee chair, he snapped, "We can't let them take over Texas." The words hung there for a fraction of a second, suspended like a suspended bridge before the cables snap. Then the room erupted, not in the chaotic chanting from before, but in a different, more chilling kind of noise. The rapid-fire clicks of camera shutters, the chirps of smartphones catching the moment in crystal clarity, and the whispered "Oh my God" from someone in the press row. Every network feed caught it, every live stream replayed it within seconds. In living rooms, bars, and offices across the country, people were hearing those 8 words without context, without spin, unfiltered, and deciding for themselves exactly what he meant. Abbott seemed to realize immediately what had just happened. His eyes darted to the committee chair, then to his aides seated along the wall. One of them shook his head subtly, already typing furiously into a phone. Jasmine didn't smile, but there was a stillness in her posture now, a kind of quiet satisfaction, like a trial lawyer who had just heard the witness volunteer the one sentence that would seal the verdict. Reporters began slipping out, phones pressed to their ears, muttering phrases like "got the soundbite" and "it's going live now." Hashtags were already forming in the digital ether. Hashtag takeover Texas, hashtag Abbott slip, hashtag Crockett strike. Outside, the crowd's chanting shifted, picking up the phrase and hurling it back at the building like a weapon. Abbott tried to recover, leaning forward into the microphone. "That's not what I meant." But the damage was done, the clip already slicing its way through the bloodstream of the internet. His protest was drowned out by the low, steady hum of voices in the gallery, the kind of sound that grows teeth once it leaves the room. Jasmine didn't speak again, she didn't need to. She simply closed the folder, her hands calm, her gaze locked on him as if to say, "You handed it to me yourself." And as the gavel came down to call the session into recess, one question rippled outward from this room into every newsroom and social feed in America. Had Greg Abbott just given them the confession they'd been waiting for? By dawn the next morning, The 8 words had consumed every headline from coast to coast. "We can't let them take over Texas" was no longer just a slip, it was a political earthquake. On cable news, the chyron burned red. Abbott's Texas takeover remark sparks national firestorm. On the Senate floor, Democratic leaders wasted no time. One by one, they stepped to the microphone, their voices sharp with outrage, reading Abbott's words into the congressional record. "If this is how redistricting is done in America," one senator declared, "then we are not a democracy, we're a gated community for the powerful." In the House, a Republican moderate from the Midwest broke ranks, his voice heavy but resolute. "I don't agree with Congresswoman Crockett on much," he said, "but suppression of votes based on race is a line that should never be crossed." The clip went viral in its own right, fuel for the growing narrative that Abbott's defense was collapsing under its own weight. At the Department of Justice, the Voting Rights Division worked late into the night, conference calls pinging between Washington and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Texas. The phrase civil rights violation began appearing in leaked memos to the press. By midday, an anonymous DOJ official told the Washington Post, "We are looking closely at the legality of the governor's actions and statements. Everything is on the table." The subtext was clear. Subpoenas could follow. Jasmine Crockett, who just days earlier had been a familiar name only in Texas politics, now found herself at the center of a national reckoning. Bookers from CNN, MSNBC, and even late-night talk shows swarmed her team. Her phone vibrated nonstop with interview requests, solidarity messages, and offers of legal backup from civil rights attorneys across the country. A campaign email she sent that morning, subject line, "They're afraid of us," broke fundraising records within hours. On the steps of the U.S. Capitol, a crowd had gathered, waving signs that read "Every vote counts" and "We stand with Jasmine." Their chants carried across the reflecting pool, picked up faintly by the live microphones inside the building. Journalists noted the shift. This wasn't just a Texas story anymore. It was becoming a litmus test for the soul of American democracy. But not everyone was celebrating. In closed-door strategy sessions, Republican operatives plotted how to frame Abbott's words as taken out of context, even floating the idea of a coordinated media blitz to muddy the waters. Meanwhile, far-right influencers doubled down, claiming Abbott's statement was common sense and warning their followers that the left's real goal is to flip Texas blue forever. As evening fell over Washington, Jasmine stood in her temporary D.C. office, staring out at the Capitol dome lit against the night sky. The city hummed with power, with intrigue, with danger. She knew she had momentum, but momentum could turn to backlash in an instant. Her team's voices buzzed behind her, debating strategy, but her mind was already on the next move. Because in this game, you didn't just survive the spotlight, you decided how to burn with it. And somewhere deep down, she could feel it. The fight wasn't heading toward resolution. It was accelerating toward a confrontation that would make everything so far look like the prologue. By the second night, Jasmine's phone had become a weapon turned against her. Each vibration, each ping, another blow she had to brace for. Her social media feeds, once a stream of campaign updates and community events, were now flooded with venom. "Traitor, you'll regret this, we know where you live." Some messages were just words. Others included pictures, grainy shots of her walking to her car, of her front porch at night, of her mother's house in Dallas. Her security detail had doubled, but the danger felt more psychological than physical. Sleep was no longer a refuge. When she closed her eyes, she saw the words projected in the hearing room, heard Abbott's voice snapping in frustration, felt the tension of a country watching her every move. Her nights became a carousel of restless pacing, cold tea abandoned on her desk, the TV flickering on mute as she read legal briefs and pored over maps until sunrise. Calls from her family carried both love and dread. Her mother's voice was steady but brittle. "Baby, I'm proud of you, but please, be careful. This fight isn't worth your life." Her brother, a former Marine, was more blunt. "You think they won't come for you because you're right. That's not how power works." She listened, grateful for their concern, but there was a steel in her that refused to bend. The montage played out like a slow-burning thriller, headlines stacking on top of each other, news anchors dissecting her tone and her motives, strangers debating whether she was a hero or a provocateur. At home, she left the curtains drawn. The sound of footsteps in the hall outside her D.C. apartment made her freeze mid-breath. Even in the Capitol corridors, she could feel eyes on her, some curious, some admiring, others carrying the weight of hostility. And yet, every time doubt gnawed at her resolve, she returned to the faces that had filled the gallery in Austin. Maria Lopez holding back tears. The young Latino man in the front row who had clasped her hand afterward and whispered, "Don't stop, please." She knew fear was the currency Abbott and his allies counted on make the cost too high, and maybe she'd step back. But that was never going to happen. Fear could be a wall, or it could be fuel. And in Jasmine's chest, it was already burning. She began keeping a single piece of paper taped to her desk, a map of Texas, marked with the districts she was fighting for. On the margin, in her own handwriting, a single line, "They don't get to decide who belongs here." As she lay in bed one night, the city's sirens wailing faintly in the distance, she realized something chilling. The threats didn't scare her as much as the possibility of losing. And in that quiet moment before sleep finally claimed her, she knew the only way forward was through the fire. Because retreat wasn't safety, it was surrender. The sun was dropping behind the Dallas skyline, painting the air in shades of gold and crimson as thousands packed into the city's central plaza. The sound hit first, a deep, rolling chant that seemed to vibrate through the concrete, every vote, every voice. From the steps of the stage, Jasmine could see a sea of faces, black, Latino, Asian, white, pressed shoulder to shoulder, signs held high like shields. Some read "Stand with Jasmine," others "We are Texas," and a few simply bore the single word that had lit a fire across the country: belong. News cameras clustered in tight formations at the foot of the stage. Drones hovered overhead, capturing the size of the crowd for every network feed. The smell of street tacos from nearby food trucks mingled with the summer air, but it was the atmosphere thick with hope and defiance that defined the scene. Jasmine stepped forward, her red blazer catching the last streak of daylight, and the chant swelled into a roar. When she spoke, her voice carried over the crowd without strain, amplified not just by microphones, but by conviction. "They can redraw lines," she began, her eyes sweeping the horizon, "but they can't erase us." The plaza erupted. She let the applause roll, let the moment breathe, then leaned closer to the mic, her tone sharpening. "These maps they push are not just lines on paper, they are walls. Walls meant to silence your voice, to cut you out of the decisions that shape your lives. But we are not a people who disappear when told to be quiet. We are not ink they can smudge away. We are here, and we will be heard." She lifted a folder above her head. Inside this are more than stories, they are affidavits, sworn statements from Texans across the state who have been pushed out of their own democracy. Maria Lopez is here tonight. Her district was split into so her voice would be split in half, but she is still here. And so are you. The camera feed caught Maria in the crowd, tears streaking her cheeks, surrounded by supporters. Jasmine's voice grew louder, riding the wave of energy. Greg Abbott and his allies believe they can design a future where only some Texans count. They think they can shrink democracy until it fits into the palm of their hand. But here's the truth: they're afraid. Because when every voice is heard, their grip on power breaks, and that day is coming. The chants rose again, louder this time, echoing off the glass towers of downtown Dallas. It was the kind of moment that felt unshakable, like the beginning of something no court could undo, but Jasmine knew better. As she looked out over the crowd, past the lights and the cameras, she could already see the storm gathering on the horizon, the courtroom battles, the legal traps, the political knives being sharpened behind closed doors. She gripped the edges of the podium, steadying herself, and closed with a line that sliced through the night air like steel. "We will fight in the streets, we will fight in the legislature, and we will fight in the courts. The only question is, will the courts stand with the people, or will they stand with the power?" The Supreme Court of Texas chamber felt like it had been carved from stone and silence. The air inside was unnaturally cold, the kind that seeped into your bones, yet beads of sweat formed at the hairlines of those waiting. Every seat in the gallery was filled, political aides in crisp suits, reporters with their pens hovering midair, and ordinary Texans clutching folded copies of the redistricting maps like battle flags. Cameras were set up along the far wall, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes, broadcasting the moment lived to millions. At the center bench, the Chief Justice adjusted his glasses, his face a mask carved from neutrality. He glanced down at the stack of papers before him, then began to read in a low, deliberate tone. "In the matter of Crockett versus Abbott," the words seemed to drip into the air, each one pulling the room tighter. Jasmine sat at the petitioner's table, hands clasped, her knuckles white. Abbott, across the aisle, leaned back in his chair with calculated ease, but his eyes never left the Chief Justice. Every sentence was a razor blade of legal jargon, cutting toward the heart of the case. The court finds that the redistricting maps, as drawn, exhibit significant racial polarization. A murmur swept the gallery, quickly hushed by the bailiff's sharp glance. Jasmine's chest tightened. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the microphones might catch it. The Chief Justice's voice didn't waver, and, therefore, violate both the Texas Constitution and the Voting Rights Act. The words hit like a thunderclap, gasps erupted, cameras zoomed in, and one reporter nearly dropped her phone in a scramble to push the breaking alert. Abbott's jaw twitched just barely but enough for Jasmine to see. Her eyes locked on him, unblinking, as the ruling continued. The Chief Justice's final line cut through the room with surgical precision. Accordingly, the redistricting plan is struck down in its entirety, and new maps shall be drawn under federal oversight. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and in that instant, the room exploded. Cheers, shouts, and the frenzied shuffle of reporters rushing for the exits. Jasmine rose slowly, as though the weight of the past months was sliding off her shoulders, one heavy piece at a time. Abbott stood too, but for the first time in their battle, he didn't have a line ready, no smirk to flash. She stepped past him without breaking stride, her voice low enough for only him to hear. This is what happens when you try to erase people. You end up erased from history instead. Outside, the roar of the waiting crowd swelled like a wave. But inside the chamber, her final glance back was not to Abbott, nor to the justices, but to the empty map stand at the side of the courtroom, a silent reminder that power, no matter how carefully drawn, can be redrawn again. The heavy oak doors of the Supreme Court swung open, and the sound that poured in from outside hit like a physical force, a wall of cheers, chants, and applause that rattled the marble floors. The Texas summer sun blazed down on the courthouse steps, casting long shadows across the crowd of thousands. They were waving signs, some with her name in bold red letters, others with the words "Every vote counts," their voices rising in a single, deafening chorus. James mine. James mine. Jasmine emerged flanked by her legal team, but it was clear who the moment belonged to. Cameras flashed in rapid bursts, catching the glint of determination in her eyes, the slight curve of a victorious smile. Behind her, through the still open doors, Abbott appeared slower, his face pale under the heat, his once confident stride replaced by something tighter, heavier. He didn't look at the crowd. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed on the ground as aides ushered him toward a waiting black SUV. Reporters shouted questions. "Governor, will you appeal?" But he said nothing, the door closing behind him with a muted thud that sounded a lot like an ending. On the steps, Jasmine raised both hands, not in triumph but in solidarity, palms open to the sea of faces below. Her voice carried easily through the loudspeakers set up along the plaza. "Today," she began, "the people of Texas proved that no amount of power, no amount of lines on a map, can erase the will of its citizens." The crowd erupted again, but she didn't pause for long. "This fight was never just mine, it was yours. And it is far from over, because as long as there are those who think democracy belongs only to the few, we will be here to remind them it belongs to all of us." Her words rolled over the plaza like a battle hymn, the kind that lingers in the chest long after the sound fades. In the crowd, Maria Lopez stood with tears streaming down her cheeks, clutching her young daughter's hand. Nearby, a group of college students unfurled a banner that read simply, "You can't silence us." As Jasmine descended the final steps, she didn't head straight for the cameras or the microphones waiting at the barricades. Instead, she walked directly into the crowd, letting the people surround her, hands reaching out to touch her shoulder, her arm, as if to anchor themselves to the moment. Somewhere behind her, the courthouse doors closed with a hollow echo, sealing Abbott inside a day that would haunt him for the rest of his career. And as the chants swelled louder, Jasmine knew this wasn't the end, it was the first line of a new map they were all about to draw together. The camera finds her in the middle of the plaza, the chaos of the cheering crowd, now a blurred halo behind her. The sunlight catches the edge of her red blazer, the same one she wore the day she first stepped into the hearing room, now carrying the dust and sweat of a war fought in plain sight. A breath is steady, her eyes locked not on the reporters or the stage, but straight into the lens, as if speaking directly into the living rooms, kitchens, and phone screens of millions watching. Democracy, she begins, her voice calm yet edged with fire, doesn't belong to a party. It doesn't belong to a governor, or a president, or a mapmaker in a back room. It belongs to the people, every single one of you, no matter where you live, no matter what you look like, no matter how you pray or who you love. She takes a step closer, filling the frame, her expression tightening with each word. It's not given to us by power. It's taken back by courage. The crowd roars behind her, but she doesn't look away from the camera. So, if you care about your voice, use it. If you care about your future, fight for it. And when they try to draw lines that cut us apart, we will draw new ones together, a final beat, because they can redraw maps. But they will never erase us. The screen fades to black. White text appears over the darkness. What does democracy mean to you? A pause, then the words shift. Comment below, let your voice be heard. The faint echo of the crowd's chant, James mine, James mine, lingers as the last frame dissolves, leaving viewers suspended between the victory they've witnessed and the battles still to come. True power is not in the hands of those who draw the lines, it lives in the courage of those who refuse to be erased. Jasmine's fight reminds us that silence only strengthens injustice, and that change begins the moment we decide to stand up, even when the odds are stacked against us. Every voice matters, every action counts. The question is, will you wait for someone else to defend your rights, or will you be the one to rise and claim them? Share in the comments what's one action you'll take to protect democracy where you live. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.